Tonight, the baby vaccine. Pfizer working towards shots for little ones ages 6 months to 5 years old. Protests at the northern border.
It just goes against everything that we have known as a democratic people.
Truckers protesting vaccine requirements, closing off ports of entry between the U.S. and Canada. Plus the search for a replacement at the Supreme Court. The latest on Ukraine. And a record number of illegal crossings at the southern border between the U.S. and Mexico. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. To vax or not? That's the question soon facing parents with young kids. Good evening in Washington, D.C. I'm Jenna Browder. Babies as young as 6 months old may soon be able to get the COVID-19 vaccine. Pfizer submitting data to the FDA for emergency use. This as protests against vaccine mandates have gridlocked parts of North America. CBN's Brady Carter has our top story. Brody?
Jenna, if this all falls into place, parents who've been anxiously waiting to vaccinate their kids will be able to do so. While some question this move, given that children tend to have less severe symptoms, CDC leaders feel the 8.5 million kids who've tested positive and 700 pediatric deaths are reason enough. Pfizer's request to greenlight a baby vaccine comes after a rocky start in clinical trials.
We saw less vaccine effectiveness. There were more infections in the children who were vaccinated than what we saw in a comparable group of 16 to 25-year-olds.
Now, Pfizer scientists believe they've made enough progress to seek emergency use for young children as soon as mid-February. It's a deadline former FDA commissioner and current Pfizer board member Scott Gottlieb doesn't seem to support.
You're looking at a timeline when this would get pushed at best perhaps into late March, because you'd have to re-adjudicate the data, have an AdCom, get the vaccine out into the supply chain. By the time that happens, I think you're looking at a March date, maybe late March.
As clinical trials in children push forward, massive pushback against mandates continue worldwide. In New York City, unvaccinated police and firefighters face termination if not vaccinated by February 11th's deadline. The city's mandate affects thousands of businesses and municipal workers alike. In Canada, roughly 12,000 truck drivers could be barred from entering the U.S. if they fail to get fully vaccinated. The order goes into effect Saturday, similar to one already imposed by Canada. The mandates have sparked a massive protest with truckers blocking entry points to Montana and North Dakota.
It's too invasive. It just goes against everything that we have known as a democratic people.
A GoFundMe page supporting this effort called Freedom Convoy has raised nearly $10 million for food and lodging for participating truckers. That's more than 3 times the amount of money Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party of Canada raised for political campaigns for the last 3 months of 2021. COVID mandates also reaching the military as Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin denied the request of 7 Republican governors that would have allowed their National Guardsmen to refuse a vaccine without consequence. Jenna, back to you.
All right, Brady Carter, thank you. And here with us now, CBN News medical reporter Lori Johnson. Lori, so babies as young as 6 months old could soon get the COVID vaccine. Of course, there are a lot of parents out there who maybe support the vaccine but have concerns about giving it to a child so young. What would you tell those parents?
Absolutely, 100% talk to your pediatrician. So a lot of we're talking about 19 million children, Jenna, who are under the age of 5. And you're right, only about 20% of children over age 5, between age 5 and 12, have gotten vaccinated. And so there is a lot of hesitancy among parents. But we are hearing parents who have children between 6 months and 5 years old who are very eager to get their children vaccinated because of daycare and preschool concerns, because these parents can't work if their children aren't able to go to daycare or preschool, and oftentimes that requires them to be vaccinated or for there to be less sickness at these places. Also, Jenna, some parents want their children vaccinated because of other people they live with, parents who might be immunocompromised, grandparents, people who live in multi-generational houses. I spoke with a doctor recently who treats COVID patients. He said a lot of his patients got COVID from the children they live with. And so then, of course, we have some children who have health issues who really do need that kind of protection. We've seen that hospitalizations among kids between the ages of 6 and 5 up during the Omicron wave.
Lori, it looks like this vaccine by Pfizer for kids under 5 could include up to 3 doses. Why the 3 doses?
So what's being proposed right now is the 2-dose regimen, simply because that has been tested and it will likely be available to parents who want to give it to their children by the end of this month. And as we just talked about, that's a lot of parents. But it does seem to indicate that the 3-dose regimen might be more effective, not any safer, but maybe more effective, particularly for the 2 to 4-year-olds. And so they're going to continue to test that. But if that is approved, it's not going to be available until the end of the spring. And so just for those parents who really want it right as soon as possible, they're going to push through that 2-dose regimen, and maybe the 3-dose regimen will come later.
You know, this Omicron variant seems like it has really spread like wildfire in this last month or so. Lori, are we at a point where enough people have natural immunity now that we've reached herd immunity?
Well, you know, that herd immunity has sort of been a moving target. But yes, so many people have some level of immunity, whether they got the original vaccine or an original virus, or whether they became sick with Omicron, because we know that there is some immunity for Omicron, but not always. And so a lot of healthcare professionals are saying, yes, there is a great deal of immunity within the environment. And maybe we can start, you know, as soon as this wave subsides, which might be at the end of the month, beginning of March, maybe we can start getting back to normal and start living with COVID.
Just a few seconds left, Lori, but what do you see moving forward for this spring with COVID?
Well, a lot of health officials are being optimistic and saying maybe this pandemic will be behind us and it will turn into an endemic. That is, of course, unless we see some sort of wicked, unpredictable variant, as we have seen in the past.
All right, we will hope. CBN medical reporter Lori Johnson. Thank you, Lori.
Thanks for having me.
Well, the countdown is on. By the end of this month, President Biden says he will name his Supreme Court Justice nominee. Today, in a meeting with Senate Judiciary Committee leaders from both sides of the aisle, the president called the selection one of the most serious responsibilities.
And I'm looking for a candidate with character, with the qualities of a judge in terms of being courteous to the folks before them and treating people with respect, as well as a judicial philosophy that is more one that suggests that there are unenumerated rights in the Constitution.
President Biden adding that in that meeting, he is seeking the advice and consent of the Senate in determining his high court nominee. Well, overseas tonight, Russia now accusing the U.S. of goading Russia into armed conflict with Ukraine. This as the Russian military amasses more than 100,000 troops along Ukraine's border. In his first public remarks on Ukraine this year, Russian President Vladimir Putin said the U.S. is ignoring the Kremlin's concerns. Putin adding that he hopes for more dialogue, even as tensions escalate with the U.S. Today at the White House, Press Secretary Jen Psaki said the U.S. is open to more talks.
The door to diplomacy remains open. We don't know what decision President Putin will make while we've seen the buildup of troops on the border.
The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, in a meeting today with his Russian counterpart, also reiterated the U.S. commitment to more dialogue in order to prevent an armed conflict. Coming up, a record year for border apprehensions. What it means for immigration in America. Welcome back. More than 2 million. That's how many migrants were stopped illegally entering the U.S. from Mexico in 2021. And that number looks to be on pace for 2022. The number in December alone, U.S. authorities detaining more than 178,000 migrants. The record numbers coming as the Department of Homeland Security struggles with staffing shortages from the pandemic. In a visit Thursday to El Paso, DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas told Border Patrol agents he's working to secure more resources for the agency. And joining us now is Anna Giratelli, Homeland Security Correspondent with the Washington Examiner. Anna, welcome. It's great to have you with us this evening. So will more resources help, or is it really more of a policy issue?
You know, it depends who you ask, right? Republicans certainly want to see policies changed. The two biggest factors driving people to the border from all over the world, not just Mexico and Central America, are the economic impacts of the coronavirus. The entire Western Hemisphere has been hit harder than the Eastern Hemisphere. So that's prompting a lot of people to come to the U.S., go to Mexico, go to other countries and apply for asylum. It's also the change between presidents, right? You went from having a very pro-enforcement Trump administration to the Biden administration saying on the campaign trail, you know, we're going to stop deportations for 100 days. We're going to roll back all these border policies that didn't allow people to apply for asylum in certain ways. So I think both policies are required. But certainly, you know, Congress also needs to give border officials, you know, more cash to be able to keep up with just the rise in people in custody and how you respond to that.
Yeah, the Biden administration, of course, under a lot of scrutiny for its immigration policy. Conservatives will say it invites more migrants to come here illegally, to your point. You know, at the same time, you have immigrants' rights groups on the left who are mad that this administration continues with some of the Trump-era policies. For the White House here, is it kind of caught between a rock and a hard place?
Yeah, it really is. I just did a story last week, and you know, the conclusion I reached was Biden didn't satisfy anyone's requests in year one. Some of the groups on the left were upset that he left the migrant protection protocols, which is called Remain in Mexico. It forced the asylum seekers to go live in Mexico while their cases move through court in the U.S. They're upset that's still in effect. The Supreme Court has forced the Biden administration to continue it. Another one called Title 42. It's just the CDC's recommendation that anyone who illegally crosses the
Okay, we seem to have lost. Oh, go ahead.
No, we're still, yeah, certainly there's major policies on the books yet that the left does not like and the right wants to, you know, make permanent.
In your view, Anna, what does the U.S. need to do to stem the tide of illegal immigration into the country?
I can't tell you my view as a reporter, but certainly I think what you're seeing now is Republicans are getting more frustrated with the lack of response from the administration. The Biden administration promised a year ago to change the asylum process, to surge asylum officers and immigration judges to the border. We have 1.5 million people in the country waiting for immigration court decisions right now, most of whom have been released from the border and into the U.S. and will go before a judge for years. But the Biden administration hasn't made any progress on those issues yet. And Republicans are, just today, Heritage Foundation came out and said, you know, if the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, is not going to resign, then we need to impeach him. And so you're seeing more of that language come out. And I think Republicans are really pivoting to want to do something more about this.
Yeah, it is curious that he was in El Paso today when that's not where, you know, the biggest problem is on the border. Anna, thank you so much for joining us. Anna Giratelli with the Washington Examiner. Thank you.
Thank you.
And when we come back, a scary scenario, what a preemptive strike on Iran by Israel would look like. An apartheid state, a new controversial report from Amnesty International gives that label to Israel, the organization pointing to Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. Israelis are denouncing the false charges and claiming the report questions the right of the Jewish state to exist. Israel's foreign minister says Amnesty International is propagating the same lies spread by terrorist organizations seeking to destroy the country. A preemptive strike by Israel against Iran's nuclear program. Speculation over this possibility has gone on for years. One Israeli analyst has studied the issue for more than a decade and has a dire warning about the devastating consequences it could bring. Chris Mitchell has the story.
In 2012, Yaakov Katz, now the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, served as the paper's defense analyst. As co-author of Israel versus Iran, The Shadow War, he examined the potential for an attack on Iran's nuclear program.
It seemed at the time that Israel was capable of doing it. I distinctly remember one meeting that I was brought into at the Air Force headquarters in Tel Aviv with the top Air Force general who basically rolled out a map on a table and showed us how the Israeli Air Force squadrons would fly to Iran.
At the time, Israel prepared night and day.
The Air Force had been training extensively for this operation. Billions and billions of shekels had been poured in to this planning and to training and to buying up the munitions and the technology and the weapons that would be needed to take out some of the facilities.
Then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Ehud Barak tried but failed to convince the cabinet, army and security chiefs to take action.
In the end, that never happened. So that was the backdrop back in 2012. And it seemed real, it seemed viable, and it seemed like Israel had a real opportunity to cause enough damage to set back Iran's nuclear program.
Now, 10 years later, the problem and targets remain the same. Natanz, Iran's main uranium enrichment facility. Fordow, with thousands of centrifuges burrowed into a mountain. To the west, Iraq, where a heavy water plutonium facility is under construction. And further south, Iran's uranium conversion facility in Isfahan. Since this scenario hasn't changed in 10 years, what about Israel's military capability?
Israel today, Chris, is stronger than it was back in 2012, right? If back in 2012 we had F-15s and F-16s, those are fourth-generation fighter jets that are detectable on radar. Today we have F-35s. These are the JSF, the Joint Strike Fighters, that have stealth-like capabilities that can basically go fly into enemy airspace, not be detected, and can take out radar installations as well as surface-to-air missile systems, can basically pave the way for then the big heavy bombers, the F-15s and the F-16s, to come in and drop a ton of munitions all over these different facilities to destroy them.
The question a lot of people have been asking over and over again throughout the years, can Israel do it?
Well, I think it's a little more complicated today, Chris. I think that back in 2012, the feeling was that, yes, it could do it. Then Iran's nuclear program is not as advanced as it is today. It was not as heavily fortified as it is today. It was not as dispersed as it is today. With that said, even then, it would have been just causing enough damage to set them back for a period of time.
Middle East expert Joel Rosenberg laid out a number of top stories to look at in 2022. At the top of the list, an Israeli attack on Iran.
We've never had to do it before. Covert operations and all kinds of other shadow activities to keep Iran from getting the bomb without having to go to what's called a kinetic war, a full-on actual war.
Katz points out even if there were an attack, it wouldn't be the end of the story.
And I think that no one has any illusion to believe that if Israel attacks Iran, that's it. There's never going to be a nuclear program. No, there can be, because the Iranians have the domestic know-how, they have the technology, it's in their heads. And while you can destroy their facilities and infrastructure, you can't take away that knowledge.
Plus, any military move likely leads to a regional war, with Iran unleashing Hezbollah, its arm in Lebanon, to fire thousands of missiles into Israel.
That is not a war we want to be in. We might have to do it, but I mean, those stakes are just so high, and I think to me, that's the far away the biggest story.
I think that Israel has means at its disposal. The question, though, comes down to, is it worth it? Is the damage that you will cause Iran's nuclear infrastructure going to be worth the war that will ensue, the international condemnations that you will almost definitely face from the world?
It's an age-old dilemma that now faces a new set of Israeli leaders.
I don't think Israel can live with a nuclear Iran, right? I think a nuclear Iran has the potential to pose an existential threat to the state of Israel. So it's not like I'm saying we should just sit back and let this happen. No, we have to do what we have to do, but we also have to realize that sometimes power has its limits. So it's complicated.
As Israeli military and political leaders increasingly warn about a looming attack, Rosenberg believes Israel's options are running out.
I don't hear it as hyperbolic. I don't hear it as trying to, be sensationalistic. I think Israeli leaders are realizing this is it. Iran has gone past all of the previous red lines that any Israeli government has ever set. But no Israeli prime minister wants to go to war.
The threat, sadly, is still there, and it needs to be dealt with. I would hope and pray that it can be dealt without the use of force, without the need for war and bloodshed. That is always the Israeli and Jewish preference, right, is to be able to do this through peaceful means, through dialogue, through discussion, through a deal. But unfortunately, we are dealing with a murderous regime that has so much blood on its hands that it's only seeking and hungry for more. And that's why it needs to be stopped.
And another part of history also remains, as Katz points out, often the Jewish people stand alone.
That famous saying of Hillel the Elder, a Jewish scholar from the period of the Talmud from a couple thousand years ago, who said back in the time in Hebrew, "Eina nidli mili," which translates into English, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? And what was true thousands of years ago for the Jewish people is still so true in the year 2022.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Still ahead, the end of an era. One of the greatest athletes of all time stepping off the field for the last time. A look at Tom Brady's legacy. Finally tonight, after a 22-year run, Tom Brady has made it official. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers quarterback announcing his retirement from the NFL today, ending an unparalleled football career. Brady was launched into the spotlight in 2001 after he took over for an injured Patriots quarterback, leading the Patriots to their first Super Bowl victory that year. The record holder in passing yards, completions, and touchdown passes is also the only quarterback to win a Super Bowl in 3 consecutive decades. Brady taking 2 teams to the Super Bowl a record 10 times and going on to win a record 6 more championships between New England and Tampa Bay. The 44-year-old said it was a difficult decision to leave the gridiron after 2 decades, adding that there's no shortcuts to success and that he was no longer able to make the competitive commitment. The oldest Super Bowl MVP and NFL MVP to play the game, saying he's proud of what his teams have accomplished and ready to leave the field to the next generation of committed athletes. And we wish him well in his next season. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, everybody. That does it for Faith Nation. We'll see you tomorrow.